Hello, everybody, and thank you for making the time to join us tonight. Tonight or today, wherever you are in the world. Summer, thank you so much for inviting me to do this great honor. What Summer and the group would like to do is we're going to have 10 more meetings after today. Today is the launch meeting to discuss this book, 10 Myths About Israel, by Ilan Pappé, who will speak to us about this today as well. And each meeting will be 1 hour long, and each meeting will cover, from next week, will cover one of the chapters in the book. We're hoping that we can ask for a volunteer who would be prepared, maybe from the second meeting onwards, who would be prepared to make a short presentation about the relevant chapter for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we will invite everybody to participate in a discussion. There is no pressure on anybody, obviously, to participate. Not everybody is comfortable. You're welcome to just listen. But in groups, in my own profession, we have a little rule of thumb that says that the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. So the more you participate, the more likely you are to feel the benefit of this experience. There was one little rule that I use in groups when I run them, and that is I call it the safety rule. And really what it's about, it's not that scary. It's just about how we give feedback to one another. So if a person speaks and you would like to comment on what they say, what we would like to ask is that you speak for yourself. So you say, when Summer said so and so, I felt, or I thought, or it reminded me of something or other. So basically your feedback is you speaking for yourself. That enables the whole group to feel safe and to feel like they can say anything and nobody's going to jump on them. And that's actually very, very important. And I hope everybody can agree to that. It's a very big group, so I can't ask for a show of hands, but I'm hoping that everybody's okay with this rule. It makes things much more much more safe and pleasant for everybody who participates. So somebody's raised a good, thank you. Any problems or questions, anything that comes up, Summer is my co-host and he will be monitoring the chat area. So if you need anything, you can send him a private chat, and Summer will also continue to admit all the people that are joining in now. Is that okay, Summer? You can take care of people. Fantastic. So a warm welcome to Professor Ilan Pappé. Hi, Ilan. He's the author of our book that we're discussing and that we will be exploring for the next 10 weeks. Ilan has written many, many books as a prolific writer, and I highly recommend pretty much every one of them. Thank you very much, Ilan, so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. I'm very grateful. We're all very grateful. You probably don't know this or didn't know this until today, but you were instrumental in my own journey out of Zionism. I met you for the first time about 23 years ago in Canberra, in Australia, and it was an event where you were the invited speaker. It was not long after I renounced my Israeli citizenship that I attended your talk, and I was in a state of dreadful emotional turmoil. I was making my first steps out of Zionism, and I was not at all sure of myself. I found your talk quite shocking, actually, and hard to stomach, although I instinctively could recognize the truth in everything you said. The perspective and knowledge that you offered closed the gaps and connected the inconsistencies in the narrative that I grew up on in Israel, and I think you know what I mean by that. After your talk, I had the chance to speak to you in Hebrew for a little while. I came to you and I introduced myself very nervously, and I remember asking you if it wasn't just a bit possible that Israelis just don't know what's going on, and they don't know the truth, and they have no idea about what you were telling us. And you know what you said to me? You said, of course they know, Abigail, they know everything, which was quite shocking to me. The quiet confidence in your knowledge gave me the last push I needed to follow the path that I have been on since then. It was a very short conversation, but it was very much enough for me. It was what I needed. At the very start of 10 Myths About Israel, you say, and I quote, "History lies at the core of every conflict. A true and unbiased understanding of the past offers the possibility of peace. The distortion or manipulation of history, in contrast, will only sow disaster." Ilan, you are one of the new historians, as they call it, who has set the record straight on Israel's history. and who brought to light the fallacy of the myths that Israel told us and is telling everyone about its history. Another new historian, who you know personally, I believe, is Benny Morris. Despite what Morris discovered himself in the Israeli state archives, and despite what he himself researched and wrote, he chose to be an apologist for Israel. Morris placed his loyalty to the tribe ahead of the truth and ahead of his intellectual honesty and integrity as a history scholar. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, Ilan, and your journey to question your upbringing and your education. How do you understand Barry Morris's choice, and why did you not choose the same path as he did? And finally, as a scholar, I know that you do not see yourself as separate from the non-scholarly world and from activism. You have always sought to make your work accessible to everybody, so it does not remain purely academic and can have a real impact in the world. What guidance can you offer us activists here in this group as we explore your book, 10 Myths About Israel? I'm passing over to you, Ilan, and you've got half an hour to speak to us and say what you need to say, what you'd like to say. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Samer and Abigail, for inviting me. Thank you so much, Abigail, for your kind words. You didn't mention, but of course, I also contributed to your excellent book.
You did.
A chapter, and your book as well is a seminal work for anyone who hasn't read it. I really, it's the ray of hope, because these are Jews and Israelis who more or less, in their different ways, undertook similar journeys. Every journey is a bit different than the others, but the fact that we are people who took different journeys than the hegemonic one, or the tribal one, let's call it, leaves us hope that maybe in later on or in the future, there will be more people who would be willing, from within the Israeli society, definitely from the Jewish communities around the world, to join the struggle for justice, freedom, and liberation in Palestine. Of course, we already see the younger Jewish generation around the world doing that in great numbers, in unbelievably great numbers. Unfortunately, I cannot report the same for the younger Jewish generation in Israel. On the contrary, I think it goes exactly in the opposite direction. But anyway, that was just a reference to Abigail's important and crucial work on the topic. Yes, I'll start by talking about myself a little bit, and also answer your question about Morris, or rather, why didn't I become a Morris, so to speak, and we'll take it from there. As you know, Abigail, but I will share it now with everyone who is listening to us, I had a very conventional Israeli Jewish upbringing, if one can call it. By conventional, I mean that that you go through elementary school, high school, and you go through the army service as well, without any particular knowledge or even curiosity about what goes on around you. You take the reality as for granted, as the only possible one. Of course, looking back at that period, you understand that you were also indoctrinated through the educational system, the cultural system, the socialization processes in the army, and so on. And therefore you were, if you want, a loyal foot soldier in the Zionist project of the colonization of historical Palestine, wherever you were or whatever you did. When I'm trying to think of where came the motive or the impulse to change, I must admit that this has nothing to do with my family. It was not that I had a terrible childhood or anything, but it was not an anti-Zionist family. It was not a very political family anyway. So it's not, I can't even say that I received a set of values, from my parents that set me on a more critical journey outside of Zionism. It must have been totally my own kind of understanding. I think a lot of it had to do with my keen interest in history from a very young age. I really loved history. Already in school, this was my favorite subject. And I also fell in love with the Arabic language, which I learned at school, and later I combined the two in my undergraduate studies at the Hebrew University when I took courses in modern history of the Middle East and in Arabic. But still, that did not yet push me to challenge the narrative, the Zionist narrative, the very set of truisms that I challenged later, as you can see in the book, of the 10 myths, as I call them. I think the turning point was, and I remember from Abigail's book that this was true of some other Israelis, the turning point came outside of Israel. It is as if you needed, first of all, to leave Israel in order to see things from the outside. Not that everyone who leaves Israel sees things from the outside, but in my case, it was very crucial. I decided to continue my studies in England, not for ideological reasons, but because in those days it was very clear that if you want to be part of the faculty later on, it's good to get a degree from the outside world, preferably Britain or the United States. So I went there, and I think the most important meeting I had was with my two supervisors I had, but one of them in particular. He was a Lebanese called Albert Hourani. He was born actually in Lebanon, but at the age of 1 year, his family moved to Manchester, but he was definitely a Lebanese. He was at the time the greatest historian in Britain of the Middle East. And he was willing to be my supervisor, which was a great honor because he was about to retire and he was willing to take me as his last student. And with him, I had the first discussions on what do I do as a professional historian. And in those days, what we did, which was quite lazy, I should say, we were, those of us who were interested, like me, in political history, were focused on the rule of declassification of archives that Britain offered, also Israel at the time. Britain offered for historians. Britain released documents every 30 years, and documents with more sensitive issue, they released them after 50 years. So in 1978, 30 years after 1948, various archives in the world, the most important of them was Britain, but also the Israeli archive, released documents about that year. And because I was interested in history, and of course I was interested in my own country's history, Albert Hourani said to me, why don't you make it relatively easy for you as a political historian? You will be one of the first one to see documents that nobody has seen before you, both in the British archives, the French archives, the United Nations archives, and the Israeli archives, and see what you can come up with, if there's anything there that can gel into a doctorate. The fact that I started working in the archives properly during the first invasion, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, was very crucial. It was the first time I felt, without even being able to articulate it, the connection between the political realities you live in and your academic research. Because we are kind of taught that academic research is totally unbiased, detached from anything, any external influence. But of course, this is a fallacy. We are human beings like anyone else, and we are influenced. And this connection between what I revealed in the archives to myself, before I shared it with anyone else, and what I revealed about the Israeli brutality in Lebanon, because I was abroad. I'm not sure I would have fully realized it had I been in Israel at the time. Kind of planted the first seeds of skepticism about the narrative that I knew and I received from very early age as an Israeli Jew. The documents about 1948 were particularly, for me, shocking, especially the Israeli ones, because they were very explicit, they were very blunt, very open about expulsions, massacres, ethnic cleansing, as I called it later on. And it shattered the world I lived in, because I was brought up, as Avigail would tell you as well, when she started her life. We were brought up on the Israeli army being the most moral army in the world, that the Palestinians are to be blamed for everything that happened to them because of their political culture, because of their hatred and animosity to Israel and to Jews, and nothing of that was corroborated by what I saw in the archives. And then I also had these conversations with Albert Hourani, who introduced me to other Palestinian historians and intellectuals. In Israel, it was very difficult to meet Palestinians on equal footing, but it was easier to do it in England. I also met later Edward Said, who had a huge influence on me. He just finished, when we met, the book, The Question of Palestine, another seminal work on the history of Palestine. So I think what I'm trying to say here is this: it's a journey that doesn't have a moment of epiphany, doesn't have a moment of awakening, but there are stations. And the stations are important because you want to know for yourself, and then you want to know about others who might have undergone the same journey. When was the point of no return, rather than when was the point of change? So I don't exactly know when it all gelled, but I do remember the moment when I said to myself, there's no way going back. And that took time. That was 1992. I remember exactly the day that it happened, because I was approached by the Communist Party in Israel. Now, I'm not a communist, but I'm a socialist, I suppose would be the best way of describing it. But I was approached by them to be a member of the Communist Party in the Israeli parliament, which I rejected. I didn't want to be a member of parliament. But you have to understand that the Communist Party was at the time the only legitimate party in Israel which was self-declared as a non-Zionist, not even an anti-Zionist, but as a non-Zionist party. It was the only party that was allowed to exist, even if it was not declaring itself as a Zionist party. And the moment and it's not, I mean, I think that I'm much more radical than most of the people in that party then and today. I'm much more Palestinian, I think, in my views. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to say that it's interesting that in a certain culture, the certain symbolic actions that you do, which helps you to find yourself. Because the message to the Israeli public is, if you joined the Communist Party, you're out of the tribe. Not because it's correct, not because exactly an accurate analysis of the positions of the Israeli Communist Party, that after all signed the Declaration of Independence with Israel, helped the Israeli army to get weapons from Russia in 1948. It was not, it's a mixed bag, right? This party is a mixed bag. But that was not the point. The point is that if you declare openly that you're joining that party, that's it. You're out of the tribe. And that was very helpful. I left the party very soon after, but I needed this kind of assurance that I can tell the world I lived in, which was Israel, that I'm leaving the tribe and continuing the research as an historian, much more liberated and far more understanding of the more wider context. of what I was doing. So I found myself finishing my doctorate already in 1984. And you mentioned Benny Morris, Abigail. It turned out that I was not the only one, which was natural. I was not the only one who was attracted by the declassification of documents after 30 years. Other historians as well wanted to see fresh evidence after 30 years of secret documents being disclosed to the public. A few of us, including Benny Morris, probably saw the same documents, which actually totally contradicted the narrative we knew as Israelis about 1948. It shows very clearly the massive expulsion of the Palestinians, the military balance that was in favor of Israel, the actions Israel took after the expulsion, namely the wiping out of villages and towns in order that people could not repatriate, the unwillingness of Israel to discuss peace after 1948, the secret agreement that Israel had with Jordan that was very important for the result of the war. So all of that was black on white in the documents. You didn't have to be very sophisticated as an historian to see that. What was interesting that a lot of other Israeli historians saw these documents, but that they didn't change the narrative. They somehow adopted the documents to the narrative rather than taking the document and challenging the narrative. And then came 2000. 2000 was a very important year for many of us. In 2000, the second Intifada, second Palestinian uprising, broke out. And by then, I was already a lecturer in Haifa. Benny Morris was already a lecturer in Ben-Gurion University in the south. And this was kind of a moment where reminds me the way Israelis today react to the 7th of October. I remember very well 2000. A lot of Israelis who saw themselves open-minded, flexible, forthcoming in their attitude towards the Palestinians said, we had a wake-up call in 2000 because it was a violent uprising led by political Islamic groups spilling over to Israel, joined by the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's a wake-up call. We mistook the Palestinians for being neighbors with whom we can have a dialogue and maybe peace. You know, it's the end of Oslo, the Oslo Accord, and so on. So there was a kind, I think a false, but a declared awakening for some people who were going with me in the same path. And they did a U-turn. They did the U-turn, including Benny Morris. They just did the U-turn. He was the only one. He was not the only one. I had a list of people who wrote what I call the mea culpa. The mea culpa is a confession. I'm to be blamed. I'm sorry. People who said we criticize Zionism, we criticize Israel, but 2000, what happened in 2000 brought us back to our senses and to the warm embrace, of course, of the Zionist narrative. It's amazing how similar it is to what you hear today from the so-called Israeli left that says, oh, we had a wake-up call on the 7th of October, and a similar discourse about we need to now be with the tribe against the Palestinians. That's a very interesting recurrent or another cycle of such a cowardness to get out of the tribe and use an excuse events, whether it's the second Intifada or the Hamas attack on the 7th of October. Why didn't I go in that direction? I don't have a good answer for that, Abigail, I have to say. I just know that it was very clear to me that I was at peace with myself already in 2000. I was then involved with a case of a student of mine who exposed an unknown massacre in 48 in a village called Tantura, south of Haifa, and he was disqualified. And my relationship with the university became more and more tense, but also my understanding of the connection between Zionist ideology and what happened in 48 and what happened in 67 and what happened later in the occupation became more solidified, because time is an important asset in the work of historian. It gives you perspective, it gives you a wider understanding, and every day that passed made me feel even more confident that I have a better understanding of the nature of Zionism as a settler colonial movement, the motivation behind the worst kinds of crimes committed, first by the Zionist movement, later by Israel against the Palestinians. It also explained to me very well, or helped me to analyze in a very, I would say, a sad way, or realize in a very sad way, that there's no chance for a change within the Israeli Jewish society in the near future, which changes your whole perspective on what is the solution for the problem. Because part of my upbringing was to say, there are two conflicting sides. Surely there's a peace camp in Israel and there's a peace camp in Palestine, and the two peace camps should meet together and there will be peace. But once you analyze Israel as a settler colonial movement and the state as an apartheid state, and you see the connection between ideology and action, and you know how widespread the ideological loyalty is in the society, you understand that this is not the right model for ending the bloodshed and the conflict. The model is dismantling the ideology and its institution that are implementing that strategy of Zionism as a settler colonial movement that can be described as having as much of historical Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. So this was a journey that in many ways ended at the beginning of this century, because I mean after that it just adding layer of understanding from my perspective at least, and it led to the inevitable departure from the Israeli academia. The reason I'm still going as much as I can over there is my very strong connection to the Palestinian minority in Israel. I wrote a whole book about them because I call the book The Forgotten Palestinians, because they are the forgotten Palestinians, and there are almost 2 million Palestinians who are totally misunderstood in the Arab world. Also, some Palestinians abroad don't fully understand the particular conditions in which the Palestinian citizens in Israel live in. But I feel very close to them because they were very loyal to me and helped me when I was kind of public enemy #1 at the beginning of the century. And therefore I try to be there, but I'm persuaded still today, even more than ever before, that we are looking for, and with this probably I would end my half an hour, that we are looking at two things which are important. One is the total failure of the Zionist project. It's not working. It's not working. The imposition of a settler colonial project, a European settler colonial project, on an Arab country, at the heart of the Arab world, at the heart of the Muslim world, is not working. It's an imposition of on millions of people to live in a way that they don't want to live, or to force them to leave, not just to live in a different way. And it's not working. With all the might, with all the American support, with everything that's happening, we can see the beginning of the collapse of this project. Collapse is not always good. It can be disastrous, but we have to admit. So that's one thing I think that is very important. The second thing, and this is towards your last question, Abigail, I really think that the Israeli success still to be immunized from practical pressure that could end its genocidal policies in Gaza, its criminal policies in the West Bank, and lead to a much better future. The immunization of this kind of, the immunity rather, of this kind of Israeli attitude has a lot to do with the fact that the narrative that Israel spans and concocted and is received as valid by its supporters, either cynically or genuinely, has a lot to do with the decontextualization or the dehistorization of the story of Palestine. It's not surprising that when the Secretary General of the United Nations intuitive reaction to the events of the 7th of October was, we have to remember that there is an historical context, he said, to what happened. And immediately he was blamed by Israel of being an anti-Semite. And they demanded his resignation. This is not surprising. The only historization that Israel, or the only historical context Israel wants, is the one that happened 2,000 years ago. The events that happened in the last 120 years, anyone who mentions them is immediately branded by Israel as an anti-Semite, at worst, or at best, someone who doesn't understand what's going on. And we should insist on knowing that history, and we should insist of having the space, as you do now, to explain to people. One of the things I try to do in the book is to show that if you are, and many of you are, I'm sure, if you are acting on behalf of Palestine, you are being immediately branded as anti-Semites and so on. And you are branded by sound bites. People say, you know, if you're anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite. If you support the Palestinian, you are a terrorist. There's no way of answering these sound bites with sound bites. What we should insist on is space and time to explain why these equations are wrong, are invalid, are inaccurate, are false, and what are the correct equations, and what is the right vocabulary and dictionary we should use when we talk about Palestine. So I think any journey into the history shows us that we're still in that historical chapter. So it's not just history. We are part of a history that is evolving, but we are subjects of that history. And we should know that history well, because we are still writing it ourselves. We're written by it, but also writing it ourselves with our activism. We can observe what I believe is happening, the collapse of the state of Israel, but we can also be part of that process to make sure that the collapse brings with it a different and better building, if I'm using the metaphor of houses here, that we will build together something much better than the building that is collapsing in front of our eyes. So maybe I'll stop here, and hopefully we can have some time for conversation. I didn't take too much of it. Sorry.
No, thank you, Ilan. That was absolutely brilliant and to the point, and also you're well within the time. I'm very impressed. What I propose is we should do a little bit of a question and answers, and if people have questions, why don't you put them on the chat, and then I will relay them to Ilan, because I think if we do a show of hands and we start all talking, I think it will not give us enough time. So one question that came up is from Brendan, and he's asking, does Ilan feel there is utility in looking at other settler colonialist projects, quote unquote, from history to better challenge the Israeli version?
Yes, Brendan. First of all, I think it's important to show that settler colonialism is a global phenomenon, and therefore there's a lot to be said for these comparisons. On the other hand, it's also important to show the particularities of the Israeli case. And one of the particularities is its historical timing. First of all, it came very late in the day compared to other settler colonial projects. This also explains the Palestinian relative success against the settler colonial movement compared to a less successful story when it comes to to the First Nations in Canada, or the Native Americans, or the indigenous people anywhere else in the world who were victims of settler colonialism. But yes, it is important because in my university in Exeter, it became very important for us to show the university that was a bit hesitant to allow all these discussions in modules and conference, to say we are talking about a global phenomenon, but what we are demanding that this is the paradigm in which you should look at Israel and Palestine. We didn't say it was exclusively a Zionist project that is only settler colonial. It wasn't just Zionism is a settler colonialist project, but that's the right perception. This is the right entry point for analyzing Zionism. So definitely, it's not surprising. There's a new journal. Well, it's already old. Settler Colonial Studies. It has already devoted 3 special issues to Palestine because settler colonialism is so relevant to what goes on in Palestine. So yes, the comparison is important, but also the particularities. And remember that this is another catchword that for people is unacceptable. In 2015, my students, I didn't even do it myself, my student organized the conference, Settler Colonialism in Palestine. And immediately there was a pressure from the Israeli lobby to cancel the conference. They didn't even understand what settler colonialism was, but they understood that if you put colonialism and Israel in the same sentence, it's not good. Luckily, my university was steadfast enough, and we did the conference in the end of the day. But it just shows you that it is, you're absolutely right, Brendan. It's important to show that this is not an exclusive allegations against Zionism. This is a proper historical analysis of a movement of Europeans that by force dispossesses another people from their homeland. And since it hasn't completed the job, it continues to do it in various means and methods.
Ilan, thank you so much. It's brilliant. I just want to hear more. We have 2 people asking the same question, and I've come across it elsewhere too. And I think it was I'm really glad it's been brought up. Donald and just want to acknowledge the 2 people who are asking, Dol and Donald, and they're asking, why wasn't a Palestinian state created alongside Israel by the United Nations in 1948?
Yeah, very good question.
It's a good question, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So why wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, the United Nations, you have to go a little bit in history to understand it. Britain ruled Palestine until the beginning of 1947. And in the beginning of 1947, it decided that it had enough of Palestine and referred the future of Palestine to the United Nations. The United Nations at the time was a very young organization. None of the colonized world was represented apart from one country, Liberia, in the United Nations. So it was still the West that actually equates the United Nations. And they were sitting and deciding what is the best future for Palestine. And the Palestinians were told by the United Nations that they would give credence both to the position of the Palestinians and the positions to the Zionist movement. And from a Palestinian perspective, the idea that the colonizers of their country, most of them, by the way, arrived 2-3 years earlier, has the same status as they about the future of the country was unacceptable. The Palestinian delegation, the Palestinians who were interlocutors with the United Nations at the time said to them, would you ask the Algerians to partition Algeria to a French Algeria and Algeria as part of decolonization? This was unacceptable to the Palestinians, that the Jews, who were 1/3 of the population, the vast majority of them arrived after 2 or 3 years earlier, who had an ideology that did not recognize the right of the indigenous people for their own homeland, that they should be equal partners. So the Palestinians totally rejected the partition. What the Palestinians, by the way, from the very beginning of the arrival of Zionism, from the very beginning, what the Palestinians demanded from the United Nations, and some member states of the United Nations even accepted, is that the West would be loyal to the 2 principles it insisted that the Arab world was too primitive to understand, and only with the guidance of the West it would be promoted to a higher level of civilization. The principle of democracy and the principle of self-determination. So the Palestinians said, okay, let's have a democratic election in historical Palestine, and let's have self-determination to the Palestinians as we're giving to the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Lebanese, and the Jordanians. To my mind, this was a very reasonable Palestinian position. And that's why the United Nations did offer to give the Palestinian, by the way, less than half of Palestine, and most of it without the major natural resources in it. And the Palestinian rejected it and said, we want a democratic Palestine, a self-determination. And the United Nations said, take it or leave it. And that the leave it meant we will allow the Zionist movement to take over Palestine if you reject our proposal. So I think that from the very beginning, the idea of giving half of Palestine to 1/3 of the population, most of them settlers with ideology of unsettling the indigenous people, was the main reason why the Palestinians did not collaborate with the United Nations, rejected the idea, and that gave an excuse to the Zionist movement to begin the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by saying the Palestinians rejected the proposal of the United Nations, so we have the right by force to take as much of Palestine as possible and expel as many Palestinians as possible.
It's interesting, Ilan, because I've heard this narrative before, but it's always kind of twisted a little bit, isn't it? Or they just didn't accept it. They offered it to them. They didn't accept it. It's their fault. This is what I grew up on. Listen, there's a lot of wonderful questions, and we only have 10 minutes left. But there's one really short one that you might be able to clarify. Somebody's asking, Tom is asking, is it true that many of the documents that were declassified in the 80s on which your research is based have since been reclassified?
Yes.
Is that correct?
It's absolutely true.
Tom, that is true. You're right.
Yeah. In 2016, the special department in the Israeli Prime Minister's office that is responsible for classification and reclassification decided to reclassify most of the documents of 1948 and close them to the public until unknown date. And the reason they gave was exactly what they call the abuse. Some historians, the way some historians abuse these sources to defame Israel. So one Haaretz journalist asked them, but you know, Ilan, for instance, already published his book, and he said, but the guy, his name was Yechiel Chorev, was responsible for this project of, God knows, maybe even burning the documents, we don't know, said, well, but people cannot go back to the documents and check whether he's right or wrong. By the way, and I will send it to you, Avigail, and maybe you can share it with others. Because of that, with few friends, I created a special website to salvage all the documents that have already been reclassified, because historians in those days were using Xerox. So we copied most of these documents. So we have them, and we intend to put them on the website for generations to come, so that there will be an archive for people to see it. I will send you the website. It's for everyone to see the documents. We are also asking for some help, if you can, of course, because we are trying to rebuild the archive of the Nakba from the point of view of the colonizer. Because we have great oral history, of course, testimonies of Palestinians, but it's also important to have the documents from Israel and the Zionist movement. So we're actually involved in this act of salvaging the documentation that shows clearly that the Palestinian claims over the years were valid and sustainable.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I'm looking at all these amazing questions, and we need about 3 hours actually, but I'll try to kind of join them together as much as possible. There are questions about what can be done to stop the current or the continuation of the genocide as we see it now. And a question from Craig is, why doesn't the United Nations not act on the UNCRC internationally legally binding obligation to protect children, for example, which Israel actually ratified? So there's questions about the role of the United Nations, why is nobody stopping it, and what can we do? What is the best thing the average person can do to work towards stopping the genocide? There's so many good questions. I'm just, if you can,
you're doing a great job. I know
maybe
it's
give
not easy.
3 minutes to that and try to squeeze a few more before
so I'll try and be short in my answer as much as I can. First of all, I think it's important to understand the Israeli perceptions about international law, human rights organization, and so on. They are regarded either genuinely or cynically as anti-Semitic. The Israelis do not believe that the ICJ, the ICC, UNICEF, the United Nations Council of Human Rights are organizations which are fair, that they really care. It's all in their mind, either cynically or genuinely, doesn't matter. That's the message they're giving their public, is that this is part of the old European or Western anti-Semitism. So there's no basis for conversation here. Secondly, the more cynical Israelis would say, well, anyway, the United States would veto in the Security Council any decision. The United States will not join the ICC because of us, and therefore we don't have to worry. There's a third level of Israelis, and we have to understand it. This is the way that Israel is going to be in the next 10 years. I call it the state. Israel is becoming the state of Judea. The state of Judea is the state of the settlers. They're taking over Israel, slowly, but they're taking over Israel. And for them, God is with them, and therefore there's no interest whatsoever in international reaction. And actually, they find their allies in the fascist parties in Europe, in people like Modi in India, and the Christian fundamentalists in the United States. It's not just the lack of will of the United Nations, it's the lack of tools that the United Nations does not have to impose its will on a rogue state like Israel. So the question is, how do we make a rogue state pay for its actions? And that connects to the other question. Because it's obvious that the international tribunals, Craig mentioned, are not, even if they wanted to do more, they won't be able to stop the genocide. The only people who would be able to stop the genocide are the governments of the West. They can stop the genocide tomorrow. With 1 week, they can stop it. Why they don't stop it is a big question, and probably a good topic for another lecture. But all in all, it's our role is to find out why there is such a gap between our civil societies and their perceptions of injustice in Palestine and the cynical position of our political elites in the West towards the question of Palestine. We know that there is a gap. Are we able to narrow it? What can we do? And I think people actually in their own places should know better than other people in other places how to do it. But the target is really to get to the places where policy are made in order to change. And who knows, maybe the young people who marched in New York would be the next senators of the United States. And then we will start to see some sort of a change. But for the genocide itself, we need to pressure and make it, I don't know, it has to be unwise for the governments of Britain, for instance, electorally or financially or whatever, or politically, not to act strongly on the genocide. We need to wreck our minds how to do it. I admit, I don't have a great idea of how to do it, but I know where power lies. And with all, and I think, of course, the mass demonstrations, everything we do is part of that attempt to make sure that our solidarity is translated into sanctions, into proper pressure, taking Israel out of FIFA, taking Israel out of the Olympics. I mean, you'll have to do it incrementally with such successes. You won't be able, but this will have an effect. Anything else symbolically would be very important in the long run and would be beneficial. But in the short run, I don't see any other way.
Ilan, this is a huge thing, isn't it? A huge topic. All of the people in this group that join us and in other groups and in other activities like this are all feeling horrified by Gaza. Many have been activists for many years, but some have become more aware of how ferocious Israel is and how dangerous since October. And everybody feels so horrified that it's hard to sleep at night and you want to do something about it. I'm sure you feel the same way. Could you just speak, just to finish, there is a very good question. There was two questions from two people, but maybe we can join them together again. They require 3 PhDs, so if you can do a justice to that in 1 minute, I don't know. Donald is asking, could you say more about the collapse of Israel? What do you mean by that? And another question that's linked up, I believe it's linked up, is from Tom, who asks, can you speak about free speech, quote unquote, or lack thereof in Israel on the topic of Palestine? Do you think you can mash these two questions together somehow?
Yeah, I can.
Good. Thank you.
If I also can broadcast my last book that just came out, which is called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, in which I try to show that after 100 years of successful lobbying for Zionism, which explains the position of Keith Starmer, the position of any prime minister in Britain or any president in the United States, I can see the waning of the power of this lobbying. It's difficult for people to see it because the collapse of the power of that lobby will take time. But I feel that as an academic, by the way, not just as an activist, that I can really detect its ineffectiveness compared to the past, because I'm doing an historical search on it. This is only one indicator to the collapse of Israel. Now, let me clearly say, I see the beginning of the collapse. And a beginning of a collapse can be a long period, unfortunately, and a very terrible period in many ways, because the regime or the structure that is collapsing is trying all it can to hold it together with the most brutal and ruthless and uninhibited way of doing that. And we can see it. We saw it, by the way, in the last days of the regime of South Africa. It was a similar case. So it's not a process for tomorrow or the day after, but I can see the beginning. The indicators of, I will do it very quickly. The implosion of the Israeli society from within, and that connects to the freedom of speech. There is no freedom of speech about the war in Gaza. Anybody who demonstrates against the war in Gaza is being arrested after 5 minutes in Israel. Any lecturer in the university that talks against the war in Gaza would find himself suspended. This is a new era in the way of Israel. I thought that I saw it all. But it doesn't compare to even what I went through, and I went through quite a lot. What they're going through is unbelievable. You're going to lose your job. You're going to be arrested for any questioning of the Israeli policies in Gaza in terms of what the Israelis are doing to Gaza. You can questioning whether the army should continue or should go to the north. These are legitimate questions the Israelis asking. But there is an implosion of the Israeli society from within. There are two camps. There is the secular Israelis, if you want to call it the state of Tel Aviv, the state of Israel, the old Israel, whatever you want to call it, that thinks that you can be a liberal apartheid state. And there is the new Judea state, the theocratic apartheid state, that sees the liberal Israelis as sinners and as the enemy as much as they see the Palestinians. And there's no common basis. Even the way they were horrified by what happened in 7th of October did not manage to keep them together, which is incredible. You would have thought, that they said it was the second Holocaust. And yet that allegedly second Holocaust and 7th of October did not keep the people together. So I'm totally convinced that this idea that Judaism as a faith can be a basis for a national identity is not working. And I don't know if you know the numbers, but almost 500,000 Israelis already left after the 7th of October. 500,000. This is the end of one particular group of Israelis that establish the state, build its cultural system, they're going out. They're going out. They're not going to be here in the next 10 or 15 years. So that's one collapse. The second one is economically, Israel is not anymore viable, doesn't have a viable economy anymore. It needs huge support from the United States. I'm not sure even the Republicans will be able to give that kind of money that Israel needs in the future. The military has proved not to be able, is unable to defend the Israelis. The Jewish world has disassociated itself its younger generation, disassociated itself from Israel. The international isolation is growing. The international isolation is growing. What is really missing is a Palestinian movement that knows what he wants. We don't have that, unfortunately. And that, I think, slows down the collapse. The fact that there is no real Palestinian national movement with a clear vision and a message. That the moment there will be, and I think there will be, I'm optimistic, there will be a consensual Palestinian suggestion what should replace Israel. I think that would accelerate the collapse and the change, and would also make sure that the transition would be to something much better. So there are these indicators. It's like a house that had cracks in it, and the 7th of October was like an earthquake that widened the cracks significantly, to the point that I think and that's the point I'm making, whether you are afraid of the end of Israel, whether you are wishing for the end of Israel, you have to talk about it. But what do the politicians of the world do in the West? They talk about the two-state solution, as if this is now the issue. Where will be the border between Israel and a mini Palestine? This is an irrelevant conversation anymore. It's not a relevant conversation anymore. The only conversation which is relevant is, can we make sure that what happened in Syria is not going to happen in Israel? That what is going on in Lebanon would not happen in Palestine. It's not just Israel and Palestine that are collapsing as nation states. Libya doesn't exist anymore. The Yemen doesn't exist anymore. Syria doesn't exist anymore. Sorry. It's a good sign to stop because I'm losing my voice.
Probably. Ilan, this is absolutely brilliant, and I have no doubt, I can't speak for other people, but I have a good, strong feeling that people would probably be sitting here wanting to listen to you for another 3 hours. I think we had very, very good questions, and you managed to weave information together to actually respond and attend to a lot of the questions and bits of questions that were there. So I apologize to anyone in advance. So if you feel that your question has not been addressed, I hope that you got something from the talk and from the responses that Ilan gave to some of the questions. Ilan, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I can't thank you enough. I know you're busy beyond belief. I thank you on behalf of Summer and the book club and everybody who's joining us. And if you ever feel like joining any of the 10 meetings where we're talking about your book, you would be very, very welcome. It's every Wednesday for 10 weeks at 7 o'clock UK time. Thank you so much. Summer, do you want to get on for a second? Is there something you want to say to everybody before we go off? Just unmute yourself.
No, just to say thank you. That's all. Thank you.